It's Founding Fathers Friday. Father's Day weekend. I wanted to talk about revolution on Father's Day weekend. I think there's a lot to learn from our founding fathers, and not just about our country, but also how to be dads. 1765 was the year. Americans are complaining about the Stamp Act. It is Parliament requiring you to pay taxes, and it's the whole taxation without representation thing. And everybody gets upset, and Parliament says to Americans, "You are children planted by our care." Well, Americans didn't like to be called children. They responded, "We are not children. We are the sons of liberty, the children of liberty." This was an amazing thing. This was about to upset all of this. This is the way the system worked. It was God. God spoke to the king told the royals and parliament and everything else. And then there was you, a serf. But there was something happening in America. People were turning into virtuous sons and daughters of liberty. And it started in churches first with this guy. We've talked about him before, George Whitefield. George Whitefield played an amazing role in America. It started at the top with God. And what he told everybody is that God's not just for the elite. You know, God's not talking to the king. He's talking to you. He's talking to you. And the whole thing started to be switched around in people's heads. Well, if God's not just talking to the king, I mean, because if you didn't vote, if you weren't a royal, the churches in England, they didn't really care. The churches were all about the king and politics. George Whitefield said, no, this is not exactly right. And what happened was it started to wake people up, and they started to say, well, wait a minute, this isn't right. This isn't right. We know that God is on the top. And there's no such thing as property. There's no such thing as a serf, even though they still didn't get it on slavery. They did start to see something completely new and very American. No serfs either. God wasn't talking to the king, and you weren't a subject of the king. You were a subject of God. God talked to you, and you were a subject of his. And then you picked if you would, the royals, Parliament, Congress, and the king, or the president. But they were subject to you. That is revolution. But again, it started with this guy, teaching us about God. That's what happened. And this was happening when our founders were young. George Washington was 16 years old, and something was happening with him as well. 16. He copied 110 rules of civility and decent behavior. This is a classic expression of Washington's respect for others, if I may quote, "Every action done in company ought to be with some sign of respect to those that are also present." Respect. And that was a big problem with the king. He wasn't respect. We were his property. It was about respect. And who had that? Washington. It's not a magnetic chalkboard. Washington had that idea. God and respect. Well, here, you can't really have a revolution. And that's why I said earlier this week when Vince Flynn and Yaron Brook from the Ayn Rand Society were on, I said, you don't want a revolution. You have a revolution, it's a nightmare. We turn into France, a bloodbath. You don't want a revolution. You can't make this kind of change unless you really know what you're talking about, unless A, God is there. And the next thing that you would need is to know who you are. You need to know what you're fighting for. I think it's who you are. You're not a subject. You're not a subject of anybody. You need to know that you are a subject of God only, that you are in control. But then you need something else. You also need education. If you don't, you can't have a revolution unless you know what you're fighting for. You know, we were talking on the set here earlier about somebody called me earlier this week from Texas and said, Glenn, you know, our founders would have picked up guns by now. No, they wouldn't have. No, they wouldn't have. How many times did they go across the sea? It took them, what, 3 or 6 months to go across the ocean to deliver a letter to the king. How many times did they do that? For how many years did they do that? Year after year after year after year. But in that time, they used that time to learn. This was a new concept. Because not only did the revolution happen here, first it happened in church, then it happened at home. Because just like there was God, and then he spoke to the king, and then he divvied things out. That's what was happening in the home as well. There was God, he spoke to Dad. Dad would tell everybody what to do because Dad had legal, almost property rights. They were serfs of Mom and the kids. He had legal rights. He would tell you. That's why we had child labor, because the kids were property. Go to work. And that's why the founders thought it was so important to educate. Educate. Because, well, slavery. Why was it illegal to teach somebody to read as a slave? Because they'd recognize their station in life was not here. Education. The whole family started to have a revolution. Dad needed to have different attributes. He wasn't just the ruler of the family. He had to, there was a different setup of the family. They're starting to look different. And our founding fathers were great examples. They each had a different element, a different piece of what made up a good father. Which I think is so ironic because that's kind of the way it works. We each are supposed to have a different piece of our Father. And we're supposed to work on that and set examples. And that's what they did. I want to talk to you about the revolution. The revolution, we've already talked about Whitefield, the revolution here of God. Tonight I want to talk to you about the revolution of the family and the fathers of our country. What is it, dads, that we're supposed to learn? Bruce Feiler is a friend of mine. He is the author of The Council of Dads, and he also is a guy who really opened my eyes with this book. You've got to read this book. If you don't have it, grab this book.
Glenn?
How are you, sir?
Nice to see you.
We were talking the other day, and it's strange how things work. It's all connections, isn't it? Strange how things work. You've been working on this. You're a religious guy. You'd written this, and this is about, you know, kind of the Moses story in America. And it brought us to our founding fathers, and we talk about it here. And now here's your new book, The Council of Dads, which is a fantastic, fantastic concept. And they fit, because our founding fathers really were the Council of Dads, weren't they?
Well, you helped me see this, Glenn, and in fact, I think they were the Council of Fathers. And the idea behind the Council of Dads was that I would ask 6 friends to be father figures for my children.
Right.
And one of the people that I was talking to during this process said to me, well, if I was creating a Council of Dads for my girls, I would put Thomas Jefferson in my Council of Dads. Because what I did, as you know, in this book was say, what's the one piece of advice you would give to my children? And he said, no one gave me better advice than Thomas Jefferson. And so the idea behind that sort of got me thinking and think, well, what is the one piece of advice that we could learn from the founding fathers? Because as you've just laid out, they really were creating not just a new country, but a new way of relating to God and a new type of man, a kind of an American man, which was a new figure. You're talking about this hierarchy you just listed.
Yeah.
In pictures in the 18th century, in 1750, the dad was always on top, the children and mother down below. By 1800, after the American Revolution, they would all be on the same level. There was a
So wait a minute, they would actually paint, or they would
there's no photography. Yes, and when you would paint, when you paint a portrait of a family, the man would be on top because he had all of the authority.
And so then the children would be painted down with mom.
Down with mom below. By the 18th century. as a result of the American Revolution, you began to see the father coming down because they were creating this new democratic idea.
What was the family? Was this like the 1960s at all in our country, where in the family dynamic where kids had a revolution themselves? Was this a smooth process? Was it how did the revolution at the dinner table in the